Hi, everybody. So, in today's video, we're going to be talking about section 5.5, which our learning target for this section is we can graph a linear inequality given an inequality or a situation in context. Now, today we're going to focus on graphing a linear inequality when we have an equation or an inequality for that graph. So, we're going to start today by reviewing how we graph an inequality. Way back in Module 4, we learned about graphing inequalities on a number line. So, one of the things that we talked about is that if the problem says x is less than 2, then the number 2 is the most important number on this graph. We also said you needed to list one number that was bigger, like the number 3, and one number that was smaller, like the number 1. If we're graphing the number 2, if we're graphing less than, we would use an open circle because there's a less than, and we would shade to the left because there's a less than. So we would shade in this direction. Now, similarly, for the graph of x is greater than 2, we would have the number 2 on our number line. We would have one number that was bigger and one number that was smaller. We would use an open circle again, but this time we would shade to the right because it's a greater than. For a problem like the next one where it says x is less than or equal to 2, we would have the number 2. We would have one number that was bigger and one number that was smaller. We would use a closed circle this time because there's an equal to with the symbol, and we would shade to the left. And finally, if our problem said x is greater than or equal to the number 2, we would have the number 2. We would have one number that's bigger and one number that's smaller. We would use a closed circle because this time there is an equal to, and we would shade to the right. So, to summarize what we know about inequalities, we use open circles, which I made this a dotted box because it's like a circle with holes in the middle. We use open circles when our symbol is a less than or a greater than. The key here is that there's no equal to. We use a closed circle, and by the way, an open circle looks like this. We use a closed circle when our symbol is a less than or equal to, or a greater than or equal to, because this time there is an equal to. We shade to the left when there's a less than or a less than or equal to, because less than means left. And we shade to the right when there's a greater than or a greater than or equal to because greater than means right. Now, the reason we're reviewing this today is that our new idea today is that we are going to be graphing inequalities that have two variables. So that's going to make this a little bit different than what we've done before. Instead of just x in our symbols, like we have here, we're going to have inequalities with two variables. To do this, we're going to need to combine what we know about graphing lines and about graphing inequalities. And we're going to do that on the next page of our notes. So let's take a look at what we would do. When we need to graph an inequality like the one shown, you'll see that there's an x and there's a y. In order to graph this, there are 4 steps that you must follow. Step number 1 is to isolate the y in the equation. In other words, we need to get y by itself. So let's practice doing that really quick. As a reminder, here's how we could rearrange this equation to get y by itself. Step number 1 would be to subtract the 3x on both sides. So my new inequality would be negative 2y is less than or equal to negative 3x plus 8. Step number 2 would be to divide by negative 2 on both sides. But one special rule about inequalities that we need to remember is that when you divide by a negative, you must flip the symbol. So when I write down my next step, I'm going to flip the inequality symbol, which means my new inequality will be y is greater than or equal to, and then I'm going to simplify. Negative 3 divided by negative 2 does not divide nicely, so I would just simplify by making two negatives into a positive, 3 over 2x, and then 8 divided by negative 2 makes negative 4. So that is step 1. Isolate y, which means get the y by itself. As a note, don't forget to flip the symbol. If you divide by a negative number. Okay, step number 2 is going to be to identify the slope and the y-intercept in the inequality. Identify the slope and y-intercept in the inequality. Now, as a reminder, slope is m and it's rise over run, and the y-intercept is going to be 0, comma something, some sort of starting point. So if I look at this inequality that I've got here, my slope would be 3 over 2, and my y-intercept, my starting point, would be 0, comma negative 4. Using that information, I can graph some points on my graph. So I would start at 0, comma negative 4, and then I would go up 3 over 2, up 3 over 2, up 3 over 2, up 3 over 2. I could also reverse by going down 3, left 2. Now don't connect the dots because here's where graphing an inequality and graphing an equation are different. The third step is to decide whether to use a solid line or a dotted line. Now, we make this decision in a very similar way to how we decided between an open circle and a closed circle. You are going to use a solid line when there is an equal to. So a nice solid line, just like you had a nice closed circle, which would be when your symbol is a greater than or equal to, or when your symbol is a less than or equal to. You are going to use a dotted line when there is no equal to, which would be when your symbol is a greater than or a less than. Now in this problem, since this symbol is a greater than or equal to, I would use a solid line because there's an equal to. So when I connect the dots, I would make a nice solid line. Last but not least, we're going to decide where to shade. So just like on our number line where we shaded either to the left or to the right, we're going to be shading on this graph, but we're not going to choose between left or right anymore. We're going to be choosing between shading above the line or shading below the line. We can decide this by looking at the symbol. So once again, above is going to mean bigger, just like going to the right meant bigger. So this is going to be when we have a greater than, which means a greater than or a greater than or equal to. Below the line is going to be when we have a less than, which means we're going to have a less than or a less than or equal to. On this graph, because we have a greater than, we're going to shade above. So on this graph, when I say above the line, I literally mean above the line. So we would shade everything that is above this diagonal line on the graph. This entire section of the graph would be above the line. What this means is that any point in this shaded region would be a solution to the inequality that we've seen. To summarize, we're going to use a solid line when we have a greater than or equal to or a less than or equal to. The key here is that there is an equal to. And we're going to use a dotted line when we have a greater than or a less than. The key here is that there is no equal to. We are going to shade above when we have a greater than or a greater than or equal to. The key here is that we have a greater than. And we are going to shade below when we have a less than or a less than or equal to. The key here is that we have a less than. So let's look at a few more example problems just to make sure we've got the right idea. So let's take a look at number 1. So number 1, our first step would be to rearrange so that the y is by itself. Since the y is already by itself here, we would just skip that step. It's already done. The next step is to identify the slope and the y-intercept. So in this equation, the slope would be 4 over 1 because that is the number that's multiplied by x. And the y-intercept would be 0, -3 because that's the number at the end. This tells me I should start on 0, -3 and go up 4 over 1, up 4 over 1, or I could reverse and go down 4, left 1. Now I need to decide between a solid line and a dotted line. I'm going to use a dotted line here because the symbol is a greater than, which means there's no equal to. So here's how you make a dotted line. You're going to line up their straight edge and then just make dashes instead of a nice, solid, smooth line. I'm just going to make like a dotted line. Finally, I'm going to decide between shading above or below. I am going to shade above because the symbol is a greater than. So above this line would be the part of the graph that's over the line. If you imagine that this line is like a staircase, this would be on top of the stairs. For problem number 2, I'm going to find my slope. And this time, I'm going to find a starting point and not a y-intercept because this is an equation or an inequality that's written in point-slope form. So my slope here would be the number outside of the parentheses, so 3 over 1. And the starting point would be -1, -2. So I'm going to start at -1, -2. I'm going to rise 3, run 1, go up 3 over 1, up 3 over 1, or I could go down 3, left 1. Now I'm going to decide between a solid line or a dotted line. I'm going to choose a solid line because there's an equal to underneath the symbol here. So I'm going to take my straight edge, I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to make a nice solid line through the points. Now I'm going to decide between shading above or shading below. I'm going to choose shading above because this symbol is a greater than. So the above part of this graph would be this guy right here. Let's do one more example. So for the next problem, I'm going to need to get y by itself before I start. So to do that, I'm going to start by subtracting the 2x on both sides, which means I get 2y is less than negative 2x plus 10. Now I'm going to divide everything by 2 in order to isolate the y. So I'm going to have y is less than 2, negative 2 divided by 2 divides nicely, so it's just negative 1x plus 10 divided by 2 is just 5. So there's my rearranged inequality. Now I'm going to identify my slope, which would be negative 1 over 1, and my y-intercept, which would be 0, 5. So I'm going to start at 0, 5, and I'm going to go down 1 over 1, down 1 over 1, and I'm going to keep going. I could also go up 1, left 1, up 1, left 1, and keep going. Now I'm going to decide between making a solid line or a dotted line. I'm going to choose a dotted line because there's no equal to for the symbol. So I'm going to line up my straight edge and just make a dotted line through these points. Next, I need to decide between shading above or shading below. I'm going to shade below because this time the symbol is a less than. Now, in order to be below this line, so under the line, I'm going to shade this region of the graph here. And I'm going to shade it. And that would be my final answer. All right, we're going to save number 4. We will do that as a warm-up in class next time that I see you. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I'll see you for some practice.